Good morning. Whoa. And a very, very happy Easter to one and all. Thanks for coming to the early service. We believe at Mayflower on every Sunday, not just Easter Sunday, that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave them no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to him, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I'm innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Here ends this reading inspired by God. May God grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
I know what you're thinking. It's Easter, Lori. Good Friday called, and it wants its crucifixion back. This Sunday is designated for post-crucifixion activities, like rolling away the stone and singing Alleluia and an egg hunt. The death of Jesus is so 5 minutes ago. But this text was offered as an alternative reading last week, and I am convinced that we are so anxious to get to happy, happy, happy Easter, we don't sit with the passion narrative long enough. We ignore the wind-up. We move a little too quickly from waving Jesus into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday to "Up from the grave he arose," without talking too much about anything else. But Jesus gets into some serious trouble between riding in on that donkey and this morning, the kind of trouble that gets a person arrested and put to death, and it seems like we ought to pay more attention to why and how it is that by Friday of the same week, Jesus is undone. Undone, the word that Soren Kierkegaard used to describe what faith should do to us. Robin used this idea from Kierkegaard in the Beecher lectures at Yale. You heard him talk about feeling undone by faith in the same way that one is disoriented, as if we are falling. On one hand, this is hard for us to imagine, especially in the progressive church. We try to give a wide berth to anything that smacks of spiritual emotionalism, to be Undone conjures the image of people at a Christian concert, lifting their hands in the air and swaying back and forth while singing something that sounds like Jesus is their boyfriend. No, thank you. But on the other hand, being undone by faith is hard for us to imagine because, quite frankly, it is a bit too all in. We would rather keep that kind of faith, whatever that means, at arm's length. Perhaps that is why we don't spend too much time with Jesus in the garden or before Caiaphas, the high priest, or in front of Pilate and the riotous crowd. Jesus was so faithful to bringing the kingdom of God that he was arrested by his own religious leaders and then executed by the empire. And because we claim to follow Jesus, we are supposed to be the same kind of faithful. And to that too, we say, no, thank you. It's not that we're worried about being put to death, mind you. This is pretty far outside the realm of possibility in America. Here, claiming Christianity is a litmus test for elected office. No one worries about being associated with Jesus, quite the opposite. You're in trouble if you aren't associated with Jesus. But really, it's the happy, happy, happy Easter Jesus in whom we are really interested. Not the Jesus who wore out his welcome, not the Jesus who is teaching too much, healing too much, doing too much. The Jesus who was undone by faith makes us nervous. So quick, let's talk about resurrection and then get to brunch. But here we are, in the middle of the trial. Jesus has been dragged by the chief priests and elders to the Roman ruler Pontius Pilate. When I was really little, I fully expected someone to step up and rescue Jesus. Every time. With childlike hope, I thought the story might change. Surely someone would do the right thing. It's a bunch of adults out there, right? Didn't they know who Jesus was? After I had heard the story enough, though, I began to only half expect someone to free Jesus. And then I slipped quickly from there into knowing that no one would save Jesus. Now, of course, I say that Jesus had to die, which of course is different than saying he was born to die, which he was not. Jesus had to die because the political authorities found him guilty of treason and the religious authorities found him guilty of blasphemy. For this, he had to die, and because Rome ran the show, he had to die on a cross. But still, wouldn't it be nice to think that someone could have saved Jesus? In the Gospel of John, there are so many people who could have done it. Pilate is the best candidate. Ultimately, he had the legal and political authority to rescue Jesus from the cross. Why doesn't Pilate just say enough? He knew that the chief priests and elders had turned Jesus into the authorities because they were jealous. The text says so. Jesus had been upstaging the religious leaders quite a bit. Every time they debated, he wiped the floor with them. And more than that, Pilate is interested in Jesus. This street preacher who has riled the religious leaders was a real curiosity, especially now that Jesus had been dragged in front of Pilate and faced certain death. He wouldn't answer questions. He refused to defend himself. How interesting, Pilate thought. Surely the crowd will see that this man should be released and Barabbas condemned. And this Jesus guy, he wasn't really that much of a troublemaker, was he? What was so bad about his teachings? True, Jesus was a little eccentric in his politics, but it really wasn't enough to turn him over to the crowd to be crucified. But that's not what happened. The crowd was loud and physical, and apparently they scared Pilate a little. Scholar Raymond Brown characterizes it this way. After examining him, Pilate thought Jesus to be inconsequential and the Jewish leaders to be acting for their own reasons. Yet when he saw that a riot was breaking out in Jerusalem because of his decision not to execute the fellow, Pilate backed down. Pilate could have sided with justice here, He was on to the motives of the priests. There would have been risk involved, though. His job was to keep the Jewish population in check. They must always know who is boss, but not feel so oppressed that they might riot. It was a careful balance. Pilate had to keep them happy enough to continue in their quiet desperation. Not conceding to their demands in this Jesus matter could make them riot. Then he would have to kill a bunch of them and maybe even ask for more troops, and that meant losing his job. So while he was interested in this Jesus fellow, he was not interested in being undone by him. And then there's Pilate's wife, who had a name, but no one bothered to write it down. This is the least of her problems, though, because she is close to being left out of the story entirely. Mark, Luke, and John don't mention her at all. Only the Gospel of Matthew includes her in the Passion narrative. As you probably already guessed, I really, really want Pilate's wife to be the hero. To stop the nonsense showmanship and save Jesus. Get it done, girl. If I were writing the story, her part would go something like this. Pilate's wife interrupts her husband mid-sentence to tell him about her dream, and then, when he tells her to leave, she refuses. The guards try to remove her, but she continues her defense of Jesus, moving between him and the crowd, between him and the soldiers. The crowd tries to shout her down, but no one is able to shut her up. She must be dragged from the scene, kicking and screaming, using her last breath to fight for Jesus. The church eventually recognizes her with a Lifetime Achievement Award for being the only voice of justice and reason in Pilate's court. Actually, that part really did happen. She was sainted by some of the Orthodox churches. But of course, the rest is not what happened. The reality is that Pilate's wife does not do everything she can to stop Jesus' execution. She protests once and then is silent. Like the rest of the bunch, she is interested in Jesus, but not interested in being undone by him. Of all the characters in this story, I think she most closely represents the entire spectrum of Christianity, fundamentalists to liberals. She does just enough for Jesus to be counted as his defender, but not enough to change anything. She plays it safe, and we can understand that. To go any further for Jesus would have required more than just lip service. Had Pilate's wife protested more, she would have been undone, replaced by another pretty face, one that would know without a doubt that she better keep her mouth shut if she wants to live. To say it another way, anything more, and her life would have had to change. And this is us. We do just enough to be counted among the faithful, but if it requires too much change, too much discomfort, too much reorganizing, we keep our mouth shut. And then there are the religious leaders, which can be a dicey topic to preach on when one wears a robe and stole. The chief priests and elders are in a real bind. Jesus keeps breaking their rules. They were important rules too. Rules keep order, they keep power, but Jesus was always sassing them about the rules. He healed people on the Sabbath and called it good, even though everyone knew that Sabbath was for resting. He talked more about love than he did about law, which confused people about what it meant to follow God. Everyone has a place, and everyone should stay in it. This was particularly important for the privileged. Equality is threatening to people at the top. But it wasn't just their own power they were worried about, though. The religious leaders were trying very hard to keep the peace with Rome. The Jewish community was allowed to practice its rituals only insofar as Rome approved. The religious leaders were the go-between. It was a careful dance. If the priests were able to keep the people in check, Rome would keep its hand light and reward those who ran the temple. If not, the religious leaders would be removed, and Rome would remind the people who exactly was in charge. Their lives and livelihood depended on a relationship with Rome that remained at all times just quiet enough. Too much noise from the people, too much grumbling or, God forbid, rioting would bring more boots on the ground, more swords, and more taxes. The priests had to keep the people quiet enough for Rome to think that everything was under control. And Rome paid its collaborators well, for it was in Rome's best interest to have as few soldiers as possible to maintain order. Resources were spread thin, as it was. So for the religious leaders, survival was about community preservation sprinkled with a little self-promotion. Yet Jesus was so interesting. The Gospels are filled with stories of the debates between Jesus and the religious elite. Back and forth they spar, Jesus always seeming to be one step ahead of them. And that was mostly okay. Perhaps they could handle Jesus agitating the people about religion. But he wasn't doing just that. He also incited the people to ruffle Roman feathers. All that stuff about going the extra mile, giving your coat and your cloak, that was political rabble-rousing. And this was interesting because no one had done it that way before. Jesus was turning everything upside down. The Jesus strategy put the occupiers in a real bind. Were the ones who were forced to go 1 mile with a soldier but then offered to go 2, were they being gracious or turning the tables? Were those who turned the other cheek being humble or subversively confrontational? If enough people started doing it, would things change? This Jesus strategy had a certain intrigue. It did not return violence for violence, yet fought the injustice of subjugation with just as much force. Perhaps this was the way to be faithful. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What kind of resistance is this? Would the Romans recognize the injustice of occupation and recant? Leave? Send flowers and an I'm sorry card? It was more likely that everything would crumble into a million pieces and there would be hell to pay. Better to keep things the way they were. A careful, orchestrated dance between the political and religious authorities. It would be easier and definitely safer to leave justice to God. No need to take a chance on upsetting the delicate balance of the system. So no, they would not save Jesus. Better to turn him over and maintain the status quo. Things might not get better for the people, but the priests' own necks would be spared. They were interested in Jesus, but not interested in being undone by him. And so it was that Jesus was crucified. All of these characters, Pilate, Pilate's wife, the religious leaders, they all could have saved Jesus. And we want that, right? Alive Jesus is better than dead Jesus. But there's the problem. Alive Jesus would have just gotten into trouble the next week because he was busy turning empire upside down. Once a troublemaker, always a troublemaker. He would have kept healing on the Sabbath. He would have kept claiming that God prefers those with pre-existing conditions. He would have kept reaching out to the outcasts, the marginalized, the stranger. He would have kept pushing for the redistribution of wealth. So it's safe to say that he would have been brought back before Pilate the next week on the same charges, and Pilate would have said, "Really, Jesus?" In a story filled with characters who are interested in Jesus, but not interested in being undone by him, it is easy to forget that someone actually did understand what Jesus was doing. We know this because we know the rest of the story. The disciples eventually left the safety of the locked house to continue the work of Jesus. The women who had assisted Jesus, his entire ministry, continued teaching and preaching and healing in his name. And we continue the doing. Turning empire upside down? This is exactly what happens when we break bread together around the communion table, declaring that everyone matters and everyone is welcome. In this beloved community, we show up at house meetings and voice accountability sessions, knowing that if we listen to each other's stories and stand with one another, things will change. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the birthplace of 363, where we make sure that people have something warm and good to eat and get a new, clean pair of socks, because sometimes that really is the most important thing. When did you feed the hungry and clothe the naked? I'm looking at a sanctuary full of schemers. People plotting to bring clothes and food and school supplies to the kids at Taft Middle School. People who are spending their time and their money to make a school safe, to relieve the pressure on parents who are working multiple jobs, to level the playing field for students who aren't born into a perfect world. These are the things that we do to bring the kingdom of God. And in doing all of these things, we participate in undoing all of the mess in the world, what we know Jesus was doing when he died. On this bright Easter morning, our story reminds us that the world is waiting. There is undoing to be done.